everyone, I am Isis with Sister Sci-Fi, and you have joined Sister Sci-Fi Wind Down Wednesday, where I work really hard to make Wednesday your new favorite day of the week. I haven't wound down like drinking a fancy beverage in a while. I am drinking water because that's what happened today. Today we're discussing the Reformatory. Um, you see that I'm holding an arc because we sold out of absolutely every single copy that for pre-orders, which is um yay! Brooklyn author, I'm glad you figured out how to get here. I know that there were some questions. Um, hey, yeah, it was
Th-
perfect. It worked out seamlessly.
There I am. Hey,
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
yes, I can. The tech is actually
Yay!
working. Let me turn on my light a little brighter. Hi, everybody.
Your lighting
I
looks
see the
perfect. Your background looks perfect.
great.
So I just
Thank you
won.
for doing this. Thank you for doing this. I
Oh,
appreciate. I mean, you're all over my Instagram. You're doing so much to uplift Black speculative fiction authors. So different from when I first started publishing. So thank you for being there. Hey, Terry Gamble, what up?
but I was gonna say, like, really, thank you for joining this live. I'm so grateful. I'm like kind of blushing. I'm just so excited. Um, wow, like we'll talk about the reformatory, but also like your whole body of work. So yeah, and we'll also talk about this later, like this whole movement around Black horror. Yes. So I'm I'm thrilled. I'm to the moon.
So much to talk about.
Yeah,
So much
I
to talk about.
can't wait for in-person events. Um, and and today, the reformatory, and as I was saying before you joined, I'm holding the arc because all our hardcover editions signed via book plate are all in the mail. Pre-orders are out there. So
I did a lot of signatures, so I'm glad to hear it.
yes. I might ask you for some more, but we can talk about that later. Uh, but yeah, so thank you, greatly appreciate that, and we could have a whole nother conversation about out there screaming. But
True.
the reformatory, um, so I'll start really big picture. So I think I was on page like 34. I was reading it. I was on a plane, and I was like crying. I don't know what the woman thought was going on with me who was sitting beside me. Um, and I'm a first generation Guinean American, so I'm
Mm.
like, this isn't in it's not in my history, it's not in my DNA. And I'm like bawling, I'm like, I will finish this because this Tananarive Due, but it's
Mm.
hard. And I couldn't imagine how I would hold space for the feelings in my body if I was a multi-generational, like African American, or if it were my family. Like these are stories from your family legacy. How
Well,
do you
let me
hold
ask.
space?
Okay. Before I answer that, I have a question for you.
Oh,
What aspect of it was the most difficult for you of seeing the past, the Jim Crow past? I call it Jim Crow horror. And in Jim Crow horror, the ghosts are scary, okay, but it's Jim Crow that's the monster,
yeah.
right?
To me, it was like the systematic, all encompassing powerlessness, even when you're
Mm,
doing the right thing,
mm,
right?
mm.
So it was the scene like Robbie had been taken away, and Gloria's like, how do I get my like my 13-year-old brother who did something like kids do every day and is good to go to like for all intents and purposes this death camp. And I was like, if that was my little sister, I would be insane, right?
Mm,
Um,
mm,
so it's literally like the powerlessness, and it's not like, oh, I don't have the tools. It was, or like, that sense of empathy. It's not like Gloria doesn't have the tools. It's like the whole system is set up to make her, to disenfranchise her, and that was scary. That was
mm.
really scary for
And
me.
that was Jim Crow,
Mhm.
and those were the stories I heard from my mother, who grew up in Quincy, Florida, which was part of what I was fictionalizing when I created Gracetown. So Gracetown is a fictitious town. Some of you might have read some of my Gracetown stories. I've been writing about Gracetown for years. Once my parents moved to upstate Florida, I finally was able to sort of get a grasp on that rural Southern writing tradition that had seemed really elusive to me up to that point because I grew up in the suburbs of Miami. So it helped me get a sense of place. The stories about just, I mean, my dad is 89 years old. And a few years ago, I mean, he was still in his 80s when he would talk about not being in Florida, but being in Indiana, when his teacher marched his entire second or third grade class to go see Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And they were turned away from the movie theater and because of race. And when he told me that story, tears welled in his eyes as a man in his 80s. So those wounds, and that's a relatively gentle wound when you compare it to obviously some of the things that were happening in the reformatory, but it was like daily. It was like parents would do everything they could to help their communities and their children feel whole. And there was a lot of insulation. You know, some people came out of that experience never knowing they were poor, never knowing, you know, that much about whiteness and interacting with whiteness because of that insulation. But when Gloria comes up against the system because she has to free her brother, honestly, I made it a schoolyard kind of kick intentionally. And I'll just stop and give a little bit of background. Robert Stevens is named for my great uncle, Robert Stevens, who was a real person. And I gave him a different story in this book. I don't want to give people the wrong idea, but in real life, he died at the Dozier School for Boys in 1937, 2 years before my mother was born. And when we heard about this, my mother had just passed away. This was her uncle. And she had been, you know, she and her father had had a fairly distant relationship. Her parents had divorced and etc. So I didn't know much about her Stevens side of the family, and still, you know, I need to learn more. I still need to know more about you know, get some relative. There are plenty of folks who are relatives of mine I have yet to learn. But we found out that his remains might be buried at the Dozier School for Boys, which is in Marietta, Florida. And it was a work camp and basically child prison masquerading as a school in Marietta, Florida. And I had never heard of it. I had never heard of the Dozier School. I didn't know anything about the attempts to shut this place down. But my dad and I, who were grieving the loss of my mother, and he's a civil rights lawyer, he helped me craft the scene in the judges' chambers because I was like, how do you deal with these Jim Crow judges? You have no leverage. And he was like, well, this is what we did. But when we went, so it was a comfort to us in a weird way to be able to go to a meeting. That was how I grew up, going to meetings with my parents. That's why I don't go to meetings anymore when I can help it. But this was any kind, except book clubs. I go to, but I'm sorry. The thought of meetings scared me so much I lost my train of thought. But these meetings were, I guess, in many ways life-changing. Because that first meeting at the Dozier School, Aaron Kimmerly, the researcher from the University of South Florida, was there making a presentation. Those students had done a whole report about the history of the Dozier School. There were survivors there, black and white. And I have a photograph of a black survivor talking to a white survivor about the things and these were old men, not old, but older men. Again, talking about things that happened to them in childhood that they were still carrying with them.
So they weren't, because I was thinking, so when did the Dozier School actually shut down, for those who don't?
Finally shut down in 2011. It opened in 1900, finally, and it was under pressure. And the survivors, or not even survivors, one of the biggest proponents to get that place shut down, as far as I understand, had a brother who died there, I believe, also in the 30s or many, many, many years ago. And his mother never got over it. And that was why he was kind of carrying that, to basically do service to his family and help get this thing shut down. Yeah, just got shut down. And I think I was rounding back to say that the reason I made it a schoolyard kick, instead of what happened in real life, which was apparently it was a breaking and entering charge. He was 15, and then another prisoner stabbed him to death. And I was like, well, I don't even want to tell that story. And who knows if there really was a breaking and entering. He could have been hungry. Who knows? I mean, that's the thing. We look at our criminal justice system today and how shaky those charges are. So imagine 1937. Did he do anything would be my question, right? But so, but in any case, I wanted to make it a gentler story, a more entertaining story, which is a tough word to use for a story like this. But trust me, compared to the research, it's much easier to think about ghosts. It's much easier to have a fantasy element in a story than it is to read the real life accounts from survivors and the things that they saw. I don't even like to discuss some of those things in interviews like this, because it's just, think about children being subjected to human monsters. And it's not just Dozier, it's the Alabama Industrial School for Negro Children, which has its own podcast. Again, I don't think I can listen to that podcast. I might try a couple episodes, but it's like, that's why it took me 7 years to write this. And I changed his transgression from the breaking and entering to a schoolyard kick, because I wanted to echo with what people are facing in the criminal justice system today. Because no matter how many things have changed, even though the colored only and white only signs have disappeared and Jim Crow has gone underground, our our prison industrial complex is way bigger now than it was in 1950. There's no comparison to 1950. And secondly, there are so many parents who have dealt with this exact same thing over schoolyard fights, where the next thing you know, your child who got in a schoolyard fight is being arrested. And there is nothing you can do about strangers taking your child away and putting them in a cage with strangers. And part of my research was into juvenile facilities, and it won't be a surprise to most people to learn that when children, and content warning here, but when juveniles are sexually assaulted while they are in custody, which is something that was a complaint at the Dozier School as well, most often it is by the guards, not by other prisoners. So this is a lingering phenomenon. There are probably people on this live right now who have dealt with a child who got caught up in criminal justice over something that should have been sending you to the principal's office, that should have been maybe you get suspended from school. But the school to prison pipeline is so real and so alive. And I saw it firsthand because, when our Black son was in kindergarten, and I volunteered in that classroom twice a week. So those teachers knew me. I had been doing my service and also keeping an eye on them and keeping an eye on him. Twice a week, I was volunteering in that classroom. The last day of kindergarten, they suspended him because he had a tantrum and kicked over a chair. Suspended him. A 6-year-old. So that goes on his school record. And as they go through the school system, those marks add up. And by the time you're in middle school, and he has ADHD and was having some trouble with time management and was getting late to class. So he had a bunch of tardies. So they called us and they were talking about a program they have for a police intervention over some tardies to class. That is what the school to prison pipeline looks like, primarily, unfortunately, for Black and brown parents. Other parents may not have that experience. I see a scenario where had I not been a Black woman and my son hadn't been Black, those kindergarten teachers probably would have just called me and said, hey, it's the last day of school, you need to pick Jason up, because I was walking distance away and they knew me. I'm not a stranger. He wasn't endangering people in the class. I mean, maybe they're afraid of Black children. That's pretty sad to be afraid of a 6-year-old, but okay. I think that's more about you, but that's something we see in policing. I mean, they're afraid. That's why they're shooting people. They're afraid and racist, but they're afraid first. And racism is part of what's causing them to be afraid.
Yeah, and you're laughing, and it's terrifying, right? To like having to navigate a criminal justice system, right? That hyper-criminalized Black people, and having to navigate the system where, like, when, like, as Black people, when we engage with the police, we have to navigate our fear and then their fear. And it's like, but y'all are
Yes.
professionals,
And
right?
that's another thing that hasn't changed from 1950. I mean, maybe we don't all feel it as pervasively or as deeply, but nobody likes to see those blue lights show up in your mirror when you're driving. You don't know who you're meeting and what kind of mood they're in and what's
Right,
going on.
right.
My dad and I were going to a meeting in Mississippi. He was still dragging me to meetings alone on a 2-lane road at night. And I mean, 2 with the speed limit, and there was a police car in front of us, so we just stayed behind it because I don't usually like to give police officers nothing better to do than run my tag to try to find something wrong I'm doing. So we stayed behind the police car, and he kept slowing down. We kept slowing down. He kept slowing down. And then finally he pulled over. We were like, "Ooh, bye!" But as
Right.
soon as we drove past him, he pulled us over. He had made up a whole, and this is something that echoes to a scene in the Reformatory, because I know that's what we're supposed to be talking about. But it really is about here and now, as much as it is a ghost story, and as much as it is about Jim Crow, Florida. He had made up a whole story in his head about who we were.
Right.
Are y'all playing peekaboo with that white pickup truck I saw driving? I'm like, what the hell are you talking about, sir? Well, I didn't say that, but that's what I was thinking. And he thought, because it was dark, he thought he just saw 2 young Black men in a car. You should have seen the look on his face when it was a woman and an old man. He knew he messed up right away, and
Right.
he was like complimenting my dad's jewelry and all kinds of nonsense, because he literally pulled us over for nothing. And luckily that ended well. But there's a deacon in Georgia for whom it did not end well, who was tased to death by police just recently. And this is something that lingers from post-slavery Jim Crow era. This notion that we are what police are policing against.
Yeah.
On site. On
Right.
site, we're the suspect, right? People following us as we walk through the grocery store. And this is just stuff you navigate. This is just life. But in 1950, especially for an activist family, families who were keeping quiet, just keeping their heads down, doing what they were told, don't make too much money so your neighbors are jealous. You know what I mean? You could avoid some of the issues that were depicted in the Reformatory. But for an activist family, based on my parents' stories, based on things that happened while we were young, that we saw with our own eyes, it's this notion of hiding and running, running and hiding. And I think that's why horror hits Black viewers a little bit different, and we have a different relationship to these movies when we see characters doing stupid things that we wouldn't do. Jordan Peele talked about that in the documentary Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror, which is on Shudder. It's not just that we're erased from the movies, or we're tropes like First to Die, Magical Negro, Sacrificial Negro, and all that, but the behavior of the white characters does not match our model of how you act when there is a mysterious or dangerous situation. And that's somewhat of a stereotype, but I think the part of it that's not a stereotype is that in living memory, for some of us, or just based on the stories we've been told by our parents or our grandparents, we are a part of a lineage of running and hiding. My grandmother had stories of seeing a body hanging from a tree, much like the lynching tree in Marianna, Florida, which is true, by the way. There is a tree at the courthouse at Marianna, Florida, where Claude Neal was lynched, that people refer to as a lynching tree. So, some of the most disturbing aspects of the Reformatory are really based on the true stories, whether it's true stories that happen in history. There's one I made up that's from some former stories in my Ghost Summer novella. That didn't happen. The McCormicks aren't real. Okay, so people getting shot on McCormick land, that's not real. It's just something that could have happened. It represents things that could have happened. But I am weaving in events that really happened. Harry T. Moore, who was martyred in the Civil Rights Movement along with his wife Harriet. I think the Klan blew up their house on Christmas Day, less than a year after this story takes place, where I made Harry T. Moore a character in the story. And Gloria, who's the older sister, doesn't see ghosts like her brother does, but Gracetown children, according to my mythology over all these stories, going back years, not just in the Reformatory, is that children have a special sensitivity to the energy on the lands in Gracetown. There's something in that soil. And it attracts creatures, it attracts spirits, swamp leeches, whatever it is. I got all kinds of stuff. Gloria is 17, so she's on her way to adulthood. She's losing her sensitivity. But she does have these little moments of precognition where she meets a Heritage more, and it doesn't even come it won't come when she wants it to come, and it comes when she can sense, oh, I can almost smell the soot in his hair. He's going to be, she has that gift. Stephen King would have called it the shining, I guess. She has a little bit of shining. Mm-hmm. And Robert can see ghosts, which is fortunate on one level because his dead mother can visit him, but unfortunate in the sense that he's about to be sent to a haunted reformatory. And it's the haunting part of it that I think made it possible for me to work on this book. I don't think well, first of all, I only write horror primarily, but I did a mother-daughter memoir with my late mother about the civil rights era. I thought for a hot minute, like, maybe I want to write this as a family memoir. I was like, no, that's not the point. That's not even what this is. For me as a horror writer, I wanted to honor Robert Stevens by name and all of the nameless children who were buried at this place without grave markers, without headstones. At one point, Robert says, like a dog is how they buried these children. You might get a letter in the mail saying, oh, by the way, your child is dead.
Right.
You're not even there because the children are sometimes actually pitching the dirt. That's something I got from memoir. Like all the worst things you can think of in this. And the thing that struck me most was what they called the White House, which was a big shed. And that was what people were talking about the most at that very first meeting, those beatings, which sound like, it's not like a, what do you call a paddling? It's not, it was literally cutting through the skin with those beatings. And the infirmary visit, that is from a witness, a survivor's story, that he couldn't even go to visiting day because he'd gone to the White House and the scars were so bad that his clothes had to be removed by the physician. Anyway, so I'm like, how can I take all this ugliness and make it into something useful? And beyond that, turn it into a story that people would want to read,
That's compelling, right? Yeah. And you do a beautiful job with the Reformatory.
Well, thank you.
The content is heavy, right? But for me, it was looking at Black history as a way of healing, right? And the horrors in it. I also want to bring in some of the comments because there are a lot of comments. Yes. People are really excited that you're here. So Tim Nolan says,
thank you for all the beautiful comments. They're kind of rolling by pretty quickly, but I do see them every once in a while. So thank you all.
Nerdy Bear Studio says, hey, Miss Tananarive Due. Brooklyn author. They are going really quickly. I love how the ghost reflects generational trauma. Like the ghosts are blast when they're just ghosts, but when they have huge meaning done so well, it's French kiss. So
thank you.
The way you utilize ghosts in a host of different ways, right? So you have ghosts as characters with Robert's mom, but you also have ghosts as historical markers. So going back to my original question, there is a lot of heaviness.
Yes.
How did you self-soothe or comfort, or like what was your process out as like during the 7 years while you were writing the Reformatory?
Procrastination was my biggest tool. I mean, I would literally just not work on it. I mean, there were so many other deadlines. That's why I had a whole short story collection, written that came out. 2 of them have come out since I started working on this book. Plus, I was working on my screenwriting career. My husband, Stephen Barnes, and I co-wrote an episode of The Twilight Zone for season 2 with Jordan Peele called A Small Town, starring Damon Wayans Jr., if you want to check that out. And we co-wrote 2 episodes of the horror noir anthology movie, which a lot of y'all don't even know about. A lot of people heard about the documentary, but
I
did not
watched the
hear they made.
documentary in the collection. I enjoyed it. So
They
yes.
that was my first adaptation after publishing in 1995. My very first adaptation was The Lake that we
Yes,
wrote
I love
for horror
that one.
noir.
That one was very.
So yeah, it was procrastination. It was, and you know, my husband and I have a podcast called Life Writing, Write for Your Life. And it's part of a system of teaching he first developed, but that I really have embraced, where one of the tenets is you write at least 1 sentence a day.
Oh,
And if anyone's curious, it's at lifewritingpremium.com, or just listen to the podcast. And that got me through a lot. Because when I tell you, first of all, my son, for part of the time, was Robert's age as I was working on the book. So that was a difficulty all by itself, because I've got a child living in my house that I'm raising my son, imagining him in this terrible place. So that's just by itself pretty dang overwhelming. The memoirs are tough reading. And that was the gist of my research. Instead of like spending my research and trying to figure out what was happening in the 1930s and what was Robert Stevens' historical story, I wanted him to be sort of an every boy who would represent a lot of different people who had gone through there. Most of them survivors, obviously, but some of them who didn't, so
mhm.
that their voices would be heard. And reading the memoirs was just rough work. Not just the horrible things that happened to them when they were younger, but how they had not been able to move on emotionally as old men. They were so unresolved and scarred by what they experienced there. So that was rough. Avoidance worked for a while. I'll tell you what finally kicked it for me. And I did something that I tell my students to do. I think it was back in, I forget the year. I want to say 2016, but I should look it up. No, it can't be 2016. I finally published a short story
Mhm.
excerpted from the book in the Boston Review, and it was the chapter, if you read it, in the Funhouse, and if you haven't read it, you'll know what I mean when you get to it. And that was a standalone chapter that I published, not just to establish IP, although that was something I tell my writing students, don't, if you're taking a long time to work on a novel, peel off a piece of it as a short story, arc, give it an arc, a beginning, middle, and end. And that chapter really didn't need much. I just took out some of the backstory, and it was a standalone story. So not only was it a sort of establishing intellectual property, but it was also a milestone for me, because that was the chapter I had most dreaded writing. I knew it was coming, and I dreaded writing it. And once I did write it, I felt so liberated to get beyond it and get on with the business of the rest of the story. Um, and then COVID came. And the thing about COVID was, I was literally, because this is OG COVID, okay? I like to say it was before we had the vaccinations. We still didn't have toilet paper. We were watching Tiger King, so we were clearly out of our minds with fear. Why were we watching that? What was wrong with us? We were afraid we were dying, people. So that was when I had 2 great fears. One, that my father might pass away before it was published, and I'm just lucky. He's 89. He turned 89 on the 22nd. That is a blessing. That is not what you expect. So that was just luck that he's even, although he does have longevity. But the other thing was that I might die. And the idea that I might die with this work unfinished was so sobering. And Steve and I talked about it, and I extracted the promise from him that he would see it through. There is another writer we mentioned as someone that I wanted him to collaborate with, to finish it, because I wanted it to have that woman's energy in there too, because part of the chapters are Gloria, the sister, and part of them are Robbie, the boy. And COVID got me on a schedule. I literally put a chart up on my wall. My goal was to write 3 to 5 pages a day. And I couldn't lie to myself about whether or not I was doing that, because it was staring me in the face, like 553320000. And that's how it was the kick in the pants. I did treat myself at one point, like before COVID, to a sort of a cabin in the woods kind of feeling. It wasn't actually in the woods, but it was a very woodsy neighborhood in Idlewild, California, which is very woodsy. And I spent a weekend there reading up to what I'd written about half of it at that point. So I read like the first half and I outlined using that sentence a day, even if it was just a sentence a day. Let me write what's going to happen next. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? And then you use that sentence a day to continue the paragraph from the day before. That was when it was tough. That was when I was really fighting past all this emotion, not wanting to be in 1950. Let's start with that. That, like, even if I'm not at the Reformatory, if I woke up tomorrow morning in 1950, I would be screaming all day. That would be horrifying. Like, it could be the best day in 1950. And no, and I don't mean just in the South either.
Right.
Because, you know, a lot of the northern states are very self-congratulatory. And California, listen, people couldn't stay, Black performers couldn't stay in those hotels in California either. And sometimes Jewish performers. So that discrimination, please, it was not just in the South. The South was more flamboyant about it, but it was not just in the South. So yeah, getting into 1950, seeing Robert, you know, what helped was the second half of the book, because I'm not going to go too much into details, but there's a point at which the energy of the book shifts from what are we going to do to this is what we're going to do. And the this is what we're going to do part, I think, is the reason I love horror. I think it's the reason I write horror, because by its very nature, horror makes you engage with characters who are experiencing something profoundly disturbing that often they have no idea existed. Like, oh my God, there's demons. Like, so my novel, The Good House, is my character Angela going from like the worst, like, emotional wreck of her lifetime. She's just an emotional wreck. Literally, she just came out of a mental institution. She discovers that demons exist, and then she has to figure out what she's going to do about it. And I joke that I don't want to go to any meetings, but one meeting I love in horror movies, there's a meeting like this in a reformatory where people are like, okay, you saw this. I don't know why in horror movies don't people tell people things. Like, tell somebody that you saw that thing in your closet. I don't care how stupid it sounds. And I hate the gaslighting in horror. I'm getting off on a tangent. But my son could have been 4 or 5 years old. But if he came to me and said there was something under his bed, you better believe I would be there with a flashlight.
You're like, let's check this out.
That is the sensibility. So that once I got to that phase of the book, like, what are we going to do now? Then it's like a liberation. Then it's, because the thing about horror is, it's not that they always win, and sometimes they don't. Horror, like, I think more than a lot of other genres, sometimes everybody just dies. You know, I don't usually do that. I like redemptive horror, but it can happen. So the point isn't even if your character lives or dies. The point is who they become, and arming themselves for that fight. How do they dig in and find their deepest courage? How do they use their imaginations to dream bigger than they ever have before, and stand taller than they ever have before? I love that. I love that about horror. I love over and over and over watching characters find that in themselves. I also love watching little survival series, like you fell off a mountain or a mountain lion attacked you, or because I like to see people dig into their grit. And that's not accidentally. It's because I feel like I need that nutrient. Yeah. I need that. When I was younger, although we were newly integrating a neighborhood and people were calling us names and throwing tomatoes against the house, and even 5-year-old kids calling us the N-word, we had our issues. I mean, it wasn't a perfect childhood, but I also never forgot how blessed I was that I had. Oh my God, someone said Stephen King just boosted the Reformatory. Oh my God, on Twitter. Oh my God. What? Okay, that is so cool. I will.
I'm so happy we captured that moment, like your reaction to
I will check that out later. See,
last
that's how much I love
on
y'all, that I have
it. So happy.
I forgot I was talking about, but that is exciting. You know, that's my. He didn't know it, but that's my teacher. You know, my mother gave me my first Stephen King novel when I was 16, The Shining. and she loved horror too. And reading Stephen King taught me so much about creating characters and
Mm.
depth of characterization, and that if you make the characters real enough, the reader or viewer will believe anything you say they're experiencing. Anything. You can get away with the most outlandish, as long as those characters are real, nothing else really matters. And that's
Speaking,
why we will read to the very end. I
I mean,
didn't even know what I was talking about, y'all, because see, I
you're
keep
talking
wanting
about grit.
I keep wanting to
Um,
delete Twitter, but it keeps calling me back. It keeps pulling me back.
um, so, so yes, um, so much. The
I'm
characters are very
sorry. I
real.
talk a lot. I am gonna look at the boost, but I'm listening. Don't think my attention is split. I am
Yeah,
definitely
you're
listening.
good. So the characters are very real in the Reformatory. Before I ask another question, is there a segment that you would like, an excerpt that you would like to read?
Oh, I had not thought about that, but I'll do a real quick one. I'll do a real
Yeah,
quick
great.
one.
I should have. I meant to send you questions beforehand and like ask if you wanted to read an excerpt, and then I finished
I'll tell
the
you what
book
I
at like
won't read.
5:14 today.
I,
So
I told you I made that. I wrote a short story about the Funhouse, and I did a reading of that one time. One time, because I'm like, oh heck no, that is not an excerpt to be shared
yeah,
with
yeah.
other people. That is you get that to yourself. So the excerpt I like to read is one that I think kind of captures Robert's childlike spirit, his first meeting with two boys who will be his friends throughout the story, and his first encounter with the ghost. They all happen very like right within a few minutes of each other. So, with your indulgence, I will do a reading. They exchanged names. The tall boy's nickname was Redbone, or just Bone. The smaller boy said he was called Blue because he was blue black, and he surely was. Robert said his nickname was Robbie, but he wanted to be called Robert. He did not want to be Robbie here. We'll get you a better nickname, Blue said. Redbone and Blue finally got around to instructing Robert on his duties. One sink for plates. He's working in the kitchen. That's a prime assignment. One for forks and spoons. There were only two rules to live by, they said. One, don't break the dishes. Two, don't leave grimes or spots. Boys who failed at washing dishes got sent out to the fields. Blue had never been to the fields, but Redbone said he'd worked on a thresher and never wanted to see corn on the cob again. Blue's family had sent him to Miami from the Bahamas when he was 8, but he'd been brought to the Reformatory after his grandmother died. He was waiting on an aunt to come get him from Bimini, but she kept getting delayed. Redbone gave Robert a knowing look as if to say, that ain't true. Redbone, who was from St. Augustine, had taken his neighbor's car joyriding when he was 10, and he'd been sentenced to 2 years. His sentence would be up in December, a month before Robert's. He might go home, or he might get leased out to the peanut mill or one of the farms. That's true. They would lease the boys out. The warden would decide, based on his behavior record. Both boys looked grim at the mention of Warden Haddock. Robert didn't want to talk about him either. You're going to need to wash faster than that, Redbone said. 100 years faster, Blue said. That was when Robert looked up and saw him. Across the kitchen, Cleo was gone. Instead, a white boy in a chef's hat and a long white apron stood in his place. He stared dead at Robert as if he'd been waiting to be noticed. His hair was cut short like Blue's, the color of pale sand. He was thin and barefoot, maybe 12 or 13. Robert looked away fast. When trouble started with white boys, colored boys lost out. I thought it was only colored boys in the kitchen, Robert said. Redbone and Blue shrugged. Well, how come they let him in here like he's spying on us? Redbone and Blue stared blankly, so Robert gestured toward the vat. The white boy was still there, still staring. What white boy? Redbone said. Robert thought they were teasing him, but their faces said different. They didn't see the boy. They looked straight past him. He's right there, Robert said. You say so, Redbone said, and went back to washing. Robert squeezed his eyes tightly, opened them, and looked around. The boy stared on. Robert could see his cool blue eyes from across the room. He had never seen eyes so blue. Just tell him he ain't real and he'll leave you be, Redbone said, most times. Not real. The boy was as real as he was, casting a shadow against the large metal vat. Robert could see his freckles. Blue spoke, hushed. I've seen that white boy. The one with the knife? Heart speeding, Robert checked to see if the boy had a knife. He was relieved to see the boy's hands empty, hanging limply at his sides. He ain't got a knife, Robert said. Must be another one then, Blue said. He checked the plates he'd stacked for chips. White boys must have worked in the kitchen before. They keep coming back, Redbone said. I bet Haints get hungry, huh, Blue? Haints. Robert's heartbeat was thunder, but he couldn't look away. Redbone went on talking to Blue, unbothered. They must be hungry. They're punching open the rice and flour bags at night, and then we get blamed. That ain't right. If you're dead, stay dead, Blue said. They could be talking about rats or roaches. And I'll leave it at that.
That is such a perfect excerpt to have shared. You did a great job creating Robert's voice and the voice of his friends. How did you develop that voice for Robert?
That was probably the hardest part. That was probably the hardest part for me because I was raising a son, but of course I never was a little boy, and I was never in an all boys space. So some of that was about the research. Some of it was just watching children and trying to understand children. But I wanted to strike that balance between kind of that hard edge you have to thrive in a situation like that, which can become very hierarchical and people are afraid. So they act out in violent ways and in bullying ways, and they're trying to establish hierarchy and navigating all those spaces. Now, I never had to navigate all that stuff mostly as a girl. I did play with a lot of little boys, but I've never been in a fight. No one's ever, literally, no one has ever shoved me. That's one of the reasons that I'm going to take my mother at her word saying that she went to jail so I wouldn't have to. That's why I don't go to in-person protests, because at my age and point in life, I'm not ready to expose myself to violence. I have a great deal of respect for people who can stand up to state violence and risk being tear gassed or risk, but I feel like if a police officer grabbed my arm, it would pull my shoulder out of socket, you know. It's like, so but in any case, shoot, I forgot what I was talking about.
Creating the voices of Robert.
The voices. Thank you. I get off and then I forget what I'm talking about. So I tried to give them just enough of that hardness, their little ploys that, like, Blue is a trickster and he uses humor, the ways that people create community, like children create community. I wanted to try to make that as realistic as possible, but also give them playfulness and give them a sense of joy, because that's the thing that I think children bring to trauma situations that we would have a very hard time. Like, I would have had a way harder time at this reformatory than Robert. And I think in a lot of ways, because I mean, not that anybody could thrive there, but holy cow, I think the only analogy I can think of is like when you give a 5-year-old an iPhone. So the first time I held an iPhone and the screen was blank, I had no idea what to do with it. My husband it was like his iPhone, and he was getting another one, so he gave me his hand-me-down. And I said, well, how do you turn it on? And he's like, it's intuitive. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, give that iPhone to a 5-year-old and see how intuitive it is. He'll have it on. He'll have hacked your password. The point is, children can be more accepting of change than adults because their whole life has changed. Every day they're growing. I mean, they're different all the time. Their clothes are different all the time. Their bodies are different all the time. So even though that is scary to kids, like puberty and things like that can be scary to kids, they're just sort of taking for granted that they have not discovered all there is about the world and that there's more to learn and all these things. So I think when people talk about the hope in the book, someone asked me about this last night. I think it's because they're children that we get that sense of of play and sense of hope in a way that might have felt very different if I were writing a book about adults in
Mm-hmm.
prison.
Yeah, no, I love that. Also, people in the live will kill me if I don't ask this question. They wanted to know how it felt when you saw that Stephen
I
King
just
had to
saw
tweet.
it. It says you're in for a treat. The Reformatory is one of those books you can't put down. Tananarive Due hit it out of the park because someone asked, "Oh my God." Anyway, I'm okay. I'm just, what is life? Okay, go on.
Okay, so
I'm
it sounds
back.
like it was amazing. Thank you for reading the tweet, and you definitely hit it out of the park. Let's talk about the cast of characters, and I purposely used the word cast of characters in the book. So we have Robert, we've talked a lot about. We have his big sister Gloria. We have Miss Lottie. We have Miss Hamilton, who's a teacher at the school, and then we have Miss Lottie's godsons,
Yes, yes.
and their women. How did you? And then we have secondary characters, Miss Anne. Um, how did you choose which characters we'd see and interact with in the book? Um, and so that's one. And what, like, 1950s Jim Crow archetypes did you want to lean into and maybe stay away from?
Okay, good question. I remember one of the reasons I don't read my Amazon reviews for the most part. I may make an exception here because they're looking like they're pretty good. My husband keeps telling me, but one of the reasons is because someone once said, "I'm surprised about the Good House. I'm surprised the dog didn't have a point of view." And I'm like, wait a minute. I mean, actually, number one, that's a good idea. But number two, it's because I do use a lot of different points of view when I write. And I like to use that as a character building exercise. I want every character who has a point of view to feel as nuanced and well created as any other character. Even if you only have a couple chapters in your voice, I want you to be able to like carry your baton to the next chapter and nobody's thinking like, oh, like, why are we even talking to him? You know? And so I wanted the book to be primarily Robert and Gloria's point of view. But the only other points of view I can think of that I have in the story are the social worker,
Mm-hmm.
David Lohman, who drives him to the reformatory, and he kind of represents sort of the liberal, sympathetic ally, but up to a certain point. And there are a lot of characters in the book who are that, because it was very, very important to me that Gloria and Robert be responsible for their own fate. That
Yes.
there was not a trope, like a white savior trope, where Brad Pitt saves the day, like in 12 Years a Slave, although that is probably historical, but it's also convenient for, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's not so Robert's life is a more integrated life than maybe some people because of his family's relationship to the Powells, who had some political power and used to like own his family back in slavery, so that they pass on nice furniture to Ms. Lottie or pass, you know, like offer to give them a piano, so they have places to go within white culture to at least ask for help. But
Mm-hmm.
mostly that's just to sort of demonstrate the limitations. And he gets a point of view because I wanted the reader to see how Robert and Gloria would look to an outsider. So he's from outside of the South and he's sympathetic, but he's also afraid. And I think that's part of the revelation for me was how much fear white supremacy caused also among white people. Because, you know, under white supremacy, you're white until you stand up for Black lives. When you stand up for Black lives, you become an N-word lover. And in some places in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, they had more animosity toward the white allies because they figured the dumb Black people, they didn't know any better. But the white allies were turncoats and traitors. And unfortunately, Heather Heyer just recently learned that at a Black Lives Matter protest. When a white woman, you would think the white womanhood and people being afraid that white womanhood was being threatened or that there were rape accusations or all these kinds of things that were so prevalent. You would think that white women are on this pedestal, but then not so much if they pick up a Black Lives Matter sign. then they are, white people get othered too, just like we're othered. Not just like, but often. I mean, I was at the Women's March, and there was a lot of waving and smiling at police officers, and the demeanor is very different at a Black Lives Matter protest, as we've all seen in the media. So the only other point of view is Warden Haddock, because I was going to there's an antagonist in the story. You want the antagonist to be scary, but also not a cartoon. And the only way I felt like I could create him not to be a complete cartoon was to get into his head and get into his history. And this is not to excuse him in any way, shape, or form. I mean, he is I forget if it's sociopath or psychopath. He's all the paths. Yeah. He's all the paths. But his grandfather was an overseer on a plantation. And I think one of the stories out of slavery that doesn't get told enough is how those histories of violence that were exercised against enslaved people also infected the homes of the white families in terms of abuse, violence. I mean, it's just it's ugly. It's just a whole, you cannot imprison other human beings and roll out of that with everything intact for the next generation. I mean, you might have that wealth, but there is a moral deficit. There is lingering trauma for everybody. There's this cloud hanging over everybody. So he's a product of his upbringing. In some ways, again, does not excuse him, but that's where he came from. So slavery in some ways gave birth to this guy. And I did that very deliberately.
And going into Superintendent Haddock's mind actually made it that much more scary for me. I don't know if that was your intention, right? It made it like, because usually the villain is like, you killing people. Like, if I watch, Freddy Krueger, he knows that killing people is wrong, right? I'm not in his mind. I don't think he's justifying it. And but when we get into Superintendent Haddock's mind, there's a part of him that thinks like he is helping to reform them, or like the boys deserve what he is offering. Yeah. And that was terrifying to me. And it's like, and it wasn't like, set in a Jim Crow South. I think I expected the antagonist, the friction to be rooted in racism, right?
And yeah, I did a hokey doke with that one.
Yes, you did. You had a lot of I was like, I was not ready for this. Superintendent. Yes, like the foundation of his evil is not like, I was just like.
In fact, I did that intentionally. I was like, how can I make him surprising? He's evil, but is there something about him that can be surprising, given the setting? And the thing about him is, because he's such a psychopath or sociopath, I forget which it is, he is outside of societal norms in the way he thinks and behaves, obviously. And that includes racial attitudes. So he, I'm not saying he's in the NAACP or anything, and he thinks Robert's father is a communist. He has bought it, or at least he says he thinks that, because anybody who was fighting for racial justice in 1950 is a communist, of course. He's made up his own mind about who he thinks Black people are, and he'll tell Robert, I don't believe a word she said. I think she's a liar. And it's just so shocking, for Robert to hear that coming from the warden of all people, about his father's rape accusation.
And so the way you did it, it was a lot. You may let me know if you're like, this comparison doesn't land. It's a lot like the dad in Get Out, who every time he's like, I would have beaten her above me a third time, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, they were pretending. I mean, actually, it's interesting. Were they pretending to be progressives and liberals? Maybe they, in a weird way in their heads, they really were. Maybe that was part of him telling the truth. I mean, they certainly did covet Blackness. So worshiping Obama would be a part of that for them, for sure.
Okay. So we have 4 minutes remaining. This has been such a great conversation. I appreciate you.
Questions.
Thank you. Okay, so this is my last official question. Then if we have time, I'll do a couple of this or that. I feel like you are a harbinger of this whole new movement around Black horror. What do you think? And I to call you like the queen of Black horror, right? What do you think about one, like this movement of Black horror, and two, the title, the queen of Black horror?
I'll start with that second part first. I once did a podcast interview, like within the past couple of years, where the podcaster used Queen of Black Horror in the headline, and I couldn't bring myself to retweet it. I felt like, oh, I can't, because there's so many Black horror writers now. Now, what I will claim is I've been publishing since 1995. That's a long time. And I'm not going to say I was the only one out there. Linda Addison, the poet and writer, was already in the Horror Writers Association. Jewel Gomez had published the Gilda Stories in 1991. And I didn't publish till 1995. But the LA Times recently did an article with the headline, I think Black horror is having a big moment, and so is its pioneer, Tananarive Due. I mean, I will receive that. I will receive that because I was out here in these Black horror streets for a long time. And, for a while in the 90s, we thought we were creating movement in a sustainable way. Brandon Massey did these Dark Dreams anthologies of Black horror stories, including people like Terrence Taylor, who's also in the Jordan Peele anthology now, all these years later. The late L.A. Banks was doing her Vampire Huntress series. I mean, we thought we had something, and then we lost Leslie, we lost L.A. Banks. And in a wider sense, in terms of Afrofuturism, and I consider horror to be a part of Afrofuturism, we lost Octavia Butler. So it really felt like for a while that entire movement we thought was sputtering to life had fractured and been lost. But now it's, and the same with bookstores. There were all these indie bookstores in the 90s. They were hand selling books and saying, I know it's got a scary cover, but you can read it. And that was a huge part of how I found my readers when I first started publishing. And then over time, they started to close down and get squeezed out. You had less and less Black bookseller representation at the big national, whatever they used to call it, ABA. I don't know what they call it now, BEA, ABA, whatever. But now, I cannot tell you how many like booksellers like you who have used technology and social media to reach your audience. There are so many, a lot of them sisters, like young Black women opening up these boutique-y, adorable bookstores. There are at least 3 in LA County that I can think of, even though we lost Estewan, but we gained Reparations Club, and we gained Octavia's Bookshelf, and we and there's one more I'm not even thinking of that has slipped my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, look at these booksellers. And in the same way, look at all the writers. Like, I mean, we have 2 Black horror adaptations, if you count Kindred 3, on the air right now. Kindred, which is not technically horror, but you could call it horror. The Changeling, Victor Laval, is on Apple TV Plus. The Other Black Girl.
So good.
At the same time, y'all don't even see. Y'all are just swimming in these waters like this is real. Like this is reality. This is not normal. Okay, it is not normal to have any Black adaptations, much less several at one time. And frankly, you couldn't fit the number of people writing just Black horror alone in one good-sized auditorium. I mean, publishing it in one good-sized auditorium. And if you add the people in the country who are publishing horror, science fiction, and fantasy, both adult and YA, it feels like that would be a huge, huge number of people. And thank you for shouting out your booksellers in your cities, and support those booksellers, because, it's sharing our reading. I mean, going back to slavery, when we were not permitted to learn how to read, and book clubs, Black book clubs were popular long before the 90s. They were popular at the turn of the century. I mean, it's like probably before that. It's been a part of our way of creating community around thought and storytelling, which all the storytelling, even if it's not horror, is about how do you get through this thing? How do we get through life?
Yes. How do you get through life?
Look at that double joint in Chicago. What a great name.
Yes.
They
call
it still in Chicago. They used to have Afrocentric books in Chicago too, but I don't know. It might have closed.
Yeah. So I hope A24 adapts the Reformatory. I would love to see
you and me both.
Yeah. in real
Well,
life.
Stephen
Okay.
King just did his part to get my name out there. Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
You will find that quote by that tweet by Stephen King and retweet it till the cows come home. So this or that. I'll do like 2 or 3. They'll be Black horror themed if I can stay on themes. So the first one is Blackula or Ganja and Hess.
Okay, wow. I'm gonna have to say Ganja and Hess because I mean I appreciate Blackula and I love William Marshall in Blackula. It's a little campy for my taste, and even though Ganja and Hess, I mean the story is a bit odd, and it's slow, but it's so beautifully shot, and that black love aspect. Now, Blackula also has a black love aspect, but I think Ganja and Hess does it in a more artistic way. And that director is Bill Gunn, by the way. And if you haven't seen Ganja and Hess, you should definitely watch it. I mean, you'll be shocked that how did I go all this time and never see Ganja and Hess? The reason is they put it in jail, and that's another reason I'm going to pick Ganja and Hess. Ganja and Hess was almost like an urban myth. People would talk about it, ask me if I'd seen it, but you could not find it anywhere. And it was literally at the Museum of Modern Art, and you had to make an appointment to watch it. Now, that is how you ensure that a movie never finds its audience. I
Right.
mean, that
Like
is
on
the
so many levels.
very definition of putting a movie in jail. I mean, they cut another version of it because they didn't like what William Gunn did with it because it was as we said in Horror Noir, it's probably a little too smart for what the studio. They wanted to rip off of Blackula. That's all they were looking for. Let's rip off Blackula, Black vampires. Bill Gunn was like, nah, we're going to talk about addiction, and we're going to talk about class, and we're going to talk about Black love, and we're going to talk about legacy and history. And it's very beautiful, but man, it's almost like jaw dropping at times. It's so different.
Yeah. So the next one is The Blackening or They Clone Tyrone.
Oh, come on.
Okay.
Oh, come on. I don't even, I'm going to cry foul for that one. I was actually on a panel discussion about They Clone Tyrone. I mean, if I had to go just straight down the genre line, I'm always going to go for the horror. Even though They Clone Tyrone does have some horror aspects, it's more science fiction. Much to love. Much to love about both. And again, how lucky are we? We have both of these movies at the same time. We have I'm a Virgo, Boots Riley at the same time. All this Afro surrealism and speculative. But I'm going to go with The Blackening because I love The Blackening. I've seen it more times than They Clone Tyrone. And it's just something that you want to watch with friends who haven't seen it. It is and what I love about it is much like Shaun of the Dead, and the horror comedy is not my favorite kind of horror at all because most people can't do it right. Because during the funny scenes, you want it to be actually funny. And during the scary scenes, you want it to be actually scary. Not everybody can pull that off. But The Blackening pulls it off. Like from jump, they're like, oh, we're serious. Or like, and then we're laughing, but then we're scared. That's my ride. I love that.
Yes. I enjoyed The Blackening, and I watched it with friends, and it was scary and hilarious.
Yes.
Fledgling or The Gilded Stories?
Oh my God. I refuse to answer that one. I just refuse to answer that one. I think both of those are legendary, so I can't even pick.
That's fine. I wanted a book one, and so this was absolutely amazing. I appreciate your work so much. The Reformatory. I was like speed reading. I was like, come on, Robert, come on, Gloria. Thank you so much for holding the reader through that. Because I can only imagine what it was like to write it. I am hoping and praying one day you'll do an in-person event with us here in Oakland.
We'll try to figure it out. I love Oakland, and I love doing events there. Some of my biggest events have been at Oakland at Marcus Books back in the day. So yeah, and
glad still here. So happy to. But yes, and no pressure. I was
just a little plug. Janice Abbott Pratt. I don't know if she's present here, but she is on Instagram. Follow her. She's the narrator for the audiobook for the Reformatory. Now, I realized I was at a bookstore last night talking about how great the audiobook was. And I was like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have been going on and on about audio in a bookstore. But once you bought your copy of the book, if you want to hear it interpreted where those children's voices sound so real, her audiobook is incredible. So if you're an audio reader, be sure to also check out the narration for the Reformatory. And thank you for the kind words. You all have been blowing up chat, and I'm literally only seeing like every third or fourth message. But thank you all for sticking it out and being here for the talk.
Yeah.
And we're still working on the Living Blood series for Hollywood, so stand by. I can't say, and there's nothing for sure, absolutely, but we have not forgotten. I'll tell you that right now.
Awesome. That is very exciting to hear. I didn't want to ask, but I'm very excited about that. I dropped the link for Janice Abbott Pratt in the chat, so you can follow them. You can follow Tananarive Due and or Sister Sci-Fi if you don't already.
Follow me, y'all. Follow me. Instagram is going to be my favorite home once I finally wean myself off Twitter. But I have to admit, it's harder when Stephen King is tweeting my book.
But you are actually, you are great on social media, like on all the platforms. So
I thank you. I had to get a little help for Facebook, but thank you. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to learn.
But you're slaying. I was like, I see all the posts across all the platforms. They're all relevant.
It's
like
it's like a second job actually. But thank you. I'm glad it's working out.
So I love it. Yes, and I think that's everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. Listen, we can negotiate those book plates. I've been noticing a gorgeous T-shirt that has my name on it that I don't have a copy of yet. So maybe we can have a work trade signature for T-shirt.
Right, absolutely. What's your size? I should.
I am medium. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll work that out. I'll tell you where to send it.
Okay. That is not a problem. That would be a pleasure and a joy.
All right. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for doing this, for creating this space for us to even talk about the Reformatory and all the other great authors and books that I see you all are talking about. Thank you all for coming. I'll see you guys on my Instagram page, and I'm gonna go to Twitter now, see what's going on with Stephen King. All right. Bye-bye. Thank you for having me on. This was great. I don't even know how to get out. Oh, here, I see. Bye-bye.
Bye.